a very big parasha to discuss. It is Parashat Ki Teitzei, and it is a parasha that has the largest number of mitzvot of any parasha in the entire Torah, according to conventional estimate. It has 74 mitzvot, which is a great number of mitzvot. Now, remember, in the book of Dvarim, Moshe is talking to Bnei Yisrael. This is his second continuing shiur, his second continuing lecture on the subject of the mitzvot and the subject of the commandments. And this is a continuation of that. In last week's parasha, which was Shoftim, the main topic was leadership, the various leaders in the community and how they contribute to the society. In this week's parasha, Ki Teitzei, I would say the overriding theme is how the functioning of this Torah society is going to have an impact on the individual. There's much more of a focus in this parasha on the individual, how the individual affects society, and how the society affects the individual as well. Let's begin by taking a look at the outline of the parasha that I've put together. It would really be difficult to cover every single detail. I have outlined in a general sense most of the topics, and we'll try to touch on them, but realize there's really a great deal to discuss in this parasha. In a very general sense, we can say that this parasha is about the individual in the Torah society, as I started to say, how the individual affects the society and how the society affects the individual. And some of the areas is in the area of family, war, justice, holiness, what I might call sensitivity to others, sensitivity to the environment even. And there is a theme that will repeat itself several times throughout this parasha, which I would call the norm is established through the extreme. I'll show you what I mean by that a few times throughout this parasha. How the halachic norm, the Torah norm, is taught to us by giving us the extreme case. And from the extreme case, we can learn what should be the norm. So the Torah parasha Ki Teitzei begins with 3 mitzvot, which in one sense all have to do with the family and the individual. But there are 3 areas that at first glance have nothing to do with each other, but the commentary starting with Rashi, going back to the Midrash, the Talmud, all say that these are interrelated. One has to do with the impact of war on the individual. It says that if a person goes to war and sees a woman among the captives that he would like to have as his own, there are specific restrictions as to how he may take her in marriage. He has to give her a month to mourn over the fact that she's not going to see her family anymore. She does various things to herself physically. She shaves her head. She deals with her nails and so on. And that's in order to cool the passions of the soldier. He may reconsider after seeing all this. But if after all of this he still wants to marry her, he may do so. And if he changes his mind, he's not permitted to treat her as a slave. He has to let her go. This is an example of a mitzvah where the Torah takes into account the strong physical feelings, passions that people have, and and makes a way for those passions to express themselves in a moderate way. He wants her, he must marry her, he must give her time first before he marries. The second, the next mitzvah, has to do with inheritance. It says man has more than one wife, and he prefers one wife over the other. He loves one wife and he hates the other. But as it happens, his firstborn, who should normally be entitled to a larger inheritance, is the firstborn of the hated wife. So the Torah says he's not permitted to show favoritism for the other son just because he has a preference for the son's mother. He has to do things according to the rules, according to justice, namely to give the firstborn the larger inheritance. And then the Torah talks about the extreme case of a son who is so rebellious in his youth, when he's very, very young, that so rebellious, uncontrollable, that the Torah even holds out the possibility of executing this rebellious son, which, by the way, Chazal tell us never actually happened, but it is important to learn about this in order to realize the importance of proper education for our children. Now, the connection between these three, says Rashi, is that if a person gives in to his passions, even though it would be better if he would not have done so. But if he gives in to his passions and he marries this captive woman, the result might very well be that he'll have two wives and two sons, one of whom deserves the inheritance and the other one doesn't deserve the larger inheritance. They both deserve an inheritance, but one deserves a larger one than the other. And the ultimate result is that the son might become rebellious. So, although the Torah allows for this, be aware of what the consequences might be down the road, and maybe on a certain level, all of this serves as a deterrent to improper or extreme behavior. These are only the first three sections of this very mitzvah-packed parasha. As I said, the norm is established through the extreme. By telling us what could be an extreme case here, we're learning important values about how to raise our children, how to get our passions under control under better circumstances. Torah goes on to the case of execution and says that under certain circumstances, after a person is executed for certain crimes, his body is suspended, is hanged as a lesson to others not to cross such a line. It happens in the case of idolatry. But the Torah then goes on to say that this hanging must not go beyond the end of the day. The person must be buried before the sun goes down. So here's a very clear case of how the extreme teaches us about the norm. Here's a person who's been executed for a terrible crime and whose body is being hanged as a deterrent. Nevertheless, even such a person's body deserves to be buried because this person, despite all of the things that he has done, is still created in God's image. His body has to be treated with proper respect and he has to be buried. And therefore, we learn that in general, someone who dies must be buried as soon as possible, preferably on the same day. So we learn the norm about burial on the same day from this extreme case. A theme that we have in a number of places in the parasha is the responsibility that we have towards the property of others. A few examples. One is the responsibility to return lost objects. You see something that belongs to someone else, one has a responsibility to get involved, not to ignore it, and instead to return return the lost object, to try to return it to its original owner. And also, there's a responsibility to help others. You see an animal that is struggling, you should help it up, help the other person unload the animal. So these very lofty ideals of the Torah even filter down to the most mundane of cases, being sensitive to somebody else's object and sensitive to other people's animals. The Torah also talks about the importance of modesty and prohibits a man from dressing in a way that a woman dresses, or a woman from dressing in the way that a man dresses, because among the Torah's value system is the value of modesty. Here we have a mitzvah, sending away the mother bird. This is a case where a person finds a nest of birds under certain circumstances and wants to take the eggs or the chicks. So before one does so, one is required to send away the mother bird before taking the chicks or the eggs. Again, the value of sensitivity filtering down even to the simplest of cases. So this Parsha deals with extremes, but it also deals with day-to-day behavior. We have a few mitzvot that I would say have to do with a certain order in the home life. For example, the responsibility of safety. If you have a roof that can be used, then the roof has to have a parapet placed around it. It's called a ma'akeh, a kind of a railing, well, more than a railing, more than a fence, in order to prevent people from having an accident. But in a general sense, we have a responsibility to remove any kind of danger or hazards. Torah also talks about not mixing certain items that are supposed to be kept separate. For example, one is not permitted to plant diverse types of plants. There's a whole discussion about exactly what types of plants, but in a general sense, we're talking about recognizing God's creation and keeping order in that creation and not interfering too much in that creation. So planting things together, for example, grapes and grain together is prohibited. Also, keeping animals separate in their work, not to yoke together a big animal and a small animal, which would pull in different directions. In a sense, we're being taught here about the importance of sensitivity to the animals, and also about not mixing certain types of clothing. That is to say, not to combine wool and linen together. This is a prohibition that the Torah calls sha'atnez. And in our days, when we buy our clothing, many of us buy our clothing pre-made, often it's necessary to have those items of clothing pre-checked to make sure that they do not contain any examples of sha'atnez, wool and linen together. And while we're talking about clothing, we also learn here, it was mentioned once earlier in the Torah, the importance of putting fringes called tzitzit on the four corners of the garments. We now have a section of mitzvot having to do with relations between men and women, marital relations, extramarital relations, accusation of infidelity, when a man accuses his wife of adultery, and how to deal with that. If it's a false accusation, he has to pay for defaming her. If it's true, and it's found to be true that she committed adultery, well, that brings us to the next subject: the punishment for adultery, and the punishment for that is execution. Both the both the man involved and the woman involved. The Torah deals with a number of cases of rape and seduction, and how to deal with those issues as well. The punishments to mete out in those cases. There's even a section about certain restrictions on those who may or may not marry into Israel. A person has a certain type of genital mutilation, which makes it impossible for them to have children, may not marry. A mamzer, which is not correctly translated as a bastard. A mamzer is really the product of an adulterous or incestuous union, and in the case of a mamzer, the Torah prohibits anyone from marrying a mamzer. We also talk about the nations of Ammon and Moab. If they can convert to Judaism, they're still not permitted to marry into the Jewish people because of the way that they treated the Jewish people in the desert, where they faced them in war and even hired Bil'am, if you remember, to try to curse them. So they deserve no permission to come in, although it should be pointed out that this prohibition applies only to the males of Ammon and Moab and doesn't apply to the females, which is why Ruth, who was a Moabite, but a Moabitess, a woman from Moab, was permitted to marry into the Jewish people. And then the Torah talks about our relations with other nations, Edom and Mitzrayim, ancient Egypt, and says that although we have some history with them, there's no reason to restrict them from marrying into the Jewish people upon the third generation. After all, Edom comes from Esav, who is the brother of Yaakov, and Egypt, well, even though Egypt mistreated us very badly, but at the beginning, we were strangers in their land and we were accepted. So here we have more about the subject of a family. The next topic, which in one sense is related to war, but really has an effect on other areas of life as well, is the subject of the holy camp. We're going to look at the verses about that in detail at the end, but what it's generally saying is that the camp of Israel, the army camp, and we'll see other camps as well, have to be kept holy. That means, among other things, maintaining a certain level of hygiene, as well as sanctity. And as I said, we're going to look at the verses about that. Here's another mitzvah that may be related to war, and that is, do not return a runaway slave. It's possible that a slave has run away to your camp while you're at war. That's at least one possibility, in order to find shelter with you. They've come into Israel. So the Torah says, under certain specific circumstances, do not return him to his master. Rather, give him an opportunity to integrate into your society freely. There are some restrictions placed on certain offerings, certain sacrifices, and I just wanted to point out that if you're following this, you realize that this parasha really covers a wide variety of areas of Jewish law, of halakha. There's hardly an area of halakha that isn't touched on in one way or another in this parasha. I often think about the 6 divisions of the Mishnah, and how every one of the divisions of the Mishnah is addressed in one way or another, the possible exception of Moed. There doesn't seem to be anything about the festivals, Shabbat or the like, in this parasha. If anybody can find a connection to Moed, that would be, I'd be glad to hear that. We had economic laws and here we have restrictions on offerings, on sacrifices, and so on. There's a section Dealing with economic justice. For example, not to charge interest when you lend money. Do not charge interest to your fellow Jew. Oaths. This also has an effect in the sanctified, in the holy realm of sacrifices. An oath might be a promise that a person makes, a commitment, let's say, to bring a sacrifice, but it could be in other areas as well that are economic. So the Torah says one is not permitted to delay beyond a certain point in the fulfilling of the oath. There's a discussion about workers' rights. When a worker works out in the field with produce that grows from the field, what is the worker permitted to eat? What is he not permitted to eat? To what extent? After all, if he's out in the field and he's working with something that is edible, are you permitted to eat? So there are some limited permission for that. We're also told that in the first year of marriage, there are certain public responsibilities that the person is freed from. And what this illustrates, once again, is the relationship of the individual to the society. Generally speaking, there are societal responsibilities, but in the first year of marriage, the most important thing in that person's life is to formulate and solidify his relationship with his spouse, and therefore the public responsibilities are lifted from him. He's given freedom from that. There are some laws that have to do with collateral. It'll come up again. If you take collateral for a loan that somebody lends you, so there are restrictions. There are certain items that may not be taken as collateral. For example, the upper millstone, when a person grinds grain, so the upper millstone may not be taken as collateral because it is so essential for the production of food. A person needs that all of the time. And there are other restrictions. If the collateral is clothing and it's the only garment that he has, you have to return it to him before he needs it the next time, and then take it again. So there are all kinds of sensitivities. If a person has put up collateral, that's because he's gotten a loan. And if he's gotten a loan, it's because he needs the money. So the collateral that he puts up might be one of the few valuable things that he has. Nevertheless, there are restrictions. Day-to-day life. And here we have a very extreme mitzvah, laws of kidnapping, and how a kidnapper is to be executed. Then we have tzara'at, how to deal with tzara'at. Tzara'at's been discussed earlier in the Torah. Here we are. Tzara'at is a disease that appears on the skin and renders a person tameh. So here we have an area of halacha in this parasha that doesn't deal with economics. It deals with tum'ah, ritual impurity. Tzara'at is at times translated as leprosy, but that's not a good translation. If a person shows signs of tzara'at, then he has to be inspected by the Kohen, and the Torah says here as well, listen to what the Kohanim say in whatever instructions they give in how to deal with tzara'at and with the tum'ah, the ritual impurity that comes as a result of tzara'at. And now, after this interlude of other mitzvot, and it's hard sometimes to see what the connection between some of the mitzvot might be. The commentaries discuss this. But then we return to some more cases of economic justice, more laws having to do with dealing with collateral or with a pledge, paying workers on time. person is a day laborer, for example, and they expect to be paid at the end of the day, so pay them on time at the end of the day, for example. It's very important because if a person's a day laborer, they might be relying on that payment quite literally in order to eat. So pay them on time. Punishing for the crime that's committed. Do not. One way of reading the verses there is that a father is not punished for the sins of the son, nor is the son punished for the sins of the father. But there's another reading that Chazal say, which is that a father is not to be found guilty, for example, based on the testimony of his son, and vice versa. Essentially, what this is also saying is that relatives up to a certain closeness are not permitted to testify in cases involving their relatives. So we return to justice. There's quite a discussion about caring for the unfortunate, which we've mentioned, which has been mentioned earlier in the Torah. The widow, the orphan, the stranger. Be aware of the fact that they need help. So we usually use the term tzedakah, which is not exactly charity. It's more doing what's right. A person is in financial need, so help them out. And along those lines, we have some other things that we give the poor to help them out, such as the forgotten sheaf. I've harvested my grain, for example, and I bring all of my grain in, and I realize I've forgotten a sheaf out in the field. So again, with certain limitations, one is not permitted to return for that which is forgotten, leave it for the poor. Here's a wonderful example, say Chazal, of a mitzvah, a very great mitzvah of helping the poor that happens not intentionally, but unintentionally. I didn't intend to leave it out there. As a matter of fact, leaving it out there intentionally is not a fulfillment of this mitzvah. It's only because I forgot that that I can do this mitzvah. My mitzvah is in not going back to retrieve it. And there are some other cases that are similar to this about leaving certain parts of that which is being harvested, unfinished grape clusters, things that fall to the ground. All of these are left for the poor. And I should just add that when the poor receive these gifts, it's not quite the same as a handout. Because the poor has to actually go and collect it, go and work for it in a sense, and that's a little bit more uplifting, a little bit more ennobling, let's say, for the poor than just giving the poor a handout, giving them an opportunity to support themselves. Some other topics that we have in this parasha. Talks about lashes. There are certain crimes for which the punishment is lashes, whipping. So the Torah says that one may not give more than 40 lashes. Chazal say that 40 is not the number that we give. 40 is too much. We give up to 40, meaning the maximum is 39. The person is examined for his health to see if he's capable of withstanding it, and then the lashes are administered in order to punish them for the committing of certain crimes. And the Torah emphasizes, don't give even one more lash than they deserve or that they can handle physically. So from this extreme case, we actually learn a more general rule, which is the prohibition against hurting somebody else. If I'm not permitted to give a criminal who is receiving the lashes to be punished for the crime, if I'm not permitted to hurt him more than he deserves, then I certainly am not to hurt a person who deserves nothing. who's not a criminal. So keep your hands to yourself, as we might tell our kids. When an animal works in the field, so we also have to be sensitive to the animal as well. If it's working with something that the animal is capable of eating, so the Torah has restrictions on muzzling the ox or the animal, because if you muzzle it, then it will not be able to eat. Again, there are restrictions on this, but the general idea is being sensitive, even to the animal, being sensitive to all of God's creations. We have a large section that's called Gibumin Chalitza. That deals with the following situation. If a man dies without children, then his widow is not permitted to marry anyone else until she either consummates or is severed from her brother-in-law. Her brother-in-law has the first responsibility of marrying her. In English, it's called levirate marriage, lever being the Latin word for brother-in-law. That marriage is called yibum, but the way of releasing both him and her from this is through chalitza, which is a ceremony in which his shoe is removed and so on, and that removes him from marrying her, and then she can go and marry anyone she wants. The assumption is that she's going to want to be married to someone within the family in order to continue her husband's legacy. Although this marriage is not done nowadays, the only thing that is done nowadays is yibum, is chalitza. The Torah talks about embarrassing someone, that if a person causes embarrassment to someone else intentionally, then that person is required to compensate for the embarrassment. The interesting thing about this case is the way the Torah portrays it. It portrays it as a case of two men having a fight, and the wife of one of them intervenes and tries to break things up by grabbing the genitals of the other man in order to embarrass him. And then the Torah says, well, the Torah's words are cut off her palm, but Chazal understand that this doesn't mean to punish her physically, but rather take something from her palm, take money in compensation for the embarrassment. It's an extreme case, but in general, what we learn here is that if a person intentionally causes embarrassment to someone else, then as dictated by the court, as evaluated by the court, there's a responsibility to compensate for that embarrassment. The Torah talks about the importance of maintaining accurate weights and measures for commerce, at home, especially in the days when produce was not pre-measured, was not pre-weighed. You didn't buy a pre-weighed package of of something. Instead, it was weighed out by you, was weighed out by the shopkeeper. So the shopkeeper has to keep accurate weights and measures and is prohibited from maintaining knowingly inaccurate weights and measures because somebody might misuse them. So it's very important, once again, for justice, not on the level of justice that is meted out in the court, but in day-to-day life. If one is aware of the value system that the Torah is portraying here, values of justice and values of holiness and so on, and that every component of the society, both individual, leader, the collective, everybody has a job to do in creating this society, then it's going to have an effect even on the day-to-day activity of weighing out a kilo of flour. That doesn't take place in the court, but it's justice nonetheless. And the last section of this parasha goes back to the story of Amalek. Amalek was a nation that attacked Israel after the Exodus, and took advantage of Israel's weakness at the time. So we're told, remember what Amalek did when you came out of Egypt, took advantage of your situation, and we're required to destroy Amalek. By the way, reading this parasha, reading this last section, is regarded as mitzvah. Remembering means reading from the Torah or hearing it read. Um, the usual way of understanding how this mitzvah is fulfilled, remembering, is to read it or hear it read from the Torah at least once a year. And the customary place that time in the year that's usually done is on the Shabbat before Purim. But if you think back a few months ago, around that time of the year, many people were unable to go to synagogue because of the current world health crisis, and they didn't hear it. So if you didn't hear it then, but you have the opportunity to hear it this Shabbat, have in mind that you fulfill the mitzvah. The custom is to do it on the Shabbat before Purim, but it can be done anytime during the year. And the parasha ends with destroy Amalek, and in a sense, the message could also be that the society that we're trying to create also has to be a society that is opposed to the forces of evil, and to try to root them out as well. Now, as promised, just for a few minutes, let's take a look at this section that talks about the holy camp. The Torah starts off talking about going to war. When you go out as a troop against your enemies, you have to be on your guard against anything untoward, anything evil. If anyone has a nocturnal emission, which renders them unclean, so they have to stay outside of the camp. So the camp is a place that has to maintain. This here is not only talking about hygiene, it's also talking about sanctity. Sanctity that comes about through Torah, through purity. In the evening, he bathes in water, goes to the mikveh, and then at sundown he re-enters. So along the way, we're not only learning about behavior in a military camp, but we're also learning about dealing with this type of tum'ah, ritual impurity, in a day-to-day basis. It lasts until the end of the day, and then a person can rejoin. Furthermore, and just listen to how the Torah is sensitive even to this most mundane of life, aspect of life. There has to be an area outside of the camp for relieving oneself. In other words, the camp is not the place to use as a bathroom. It has to be a properly designated place. And it doesn't matter whether one is in a military camp or one has set up camp somewhere else. One has to be aware that war does not give one permission to forget the basics of propriety, hygiene, and holiness. Not only that with your gear you shall have a spike. The Torah here is saying that among the equipment that a soldier has to have at all times is, here it calls a spike, it could be a spade, some kind of a digging implement, so that if a person needs to relieve himself, he digs a hole and covers it up. Why this detail? Since the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you. Right? God is going to deliver you from your enemies. You have to realize that in the camp, not only in holy places, but even in the camp, when you're out at war, God's presence is there. V'haya machanecha kadosh, and your camp shall be holy, and therefore you don't want God to find anything inappropriate. So we're not only talking about the military camp, actually. The context is a military camp, but it's true really of other areas as well. As a matter of fact, from the way that the Torah talks about this, we learn that one has to maintain a certain level of hygiene holiness in the area around which a person is praying. Um, and nowadays, with the world pandemic, it's very, very common for people to find themselves praying not in a synagogue, but outdoors. So it's important to take a look around and make sure that the area is hygienic. The Haya Machanecha Kadosh, your camp shall be holy. As a final comment from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, we take note of the fact, this part that I highlighted, the Haya Machanecha Kadosh is a grammatical anomaly here. Kadosh, which is an adjective meaning holy, is singular, and yet Machanecha is written with this letter Yud over here, and that would indicate that it is plural. So does it mean your camp shall be holy or your camps shall be holy? The way it's supposed to be understood is that it means camp, singular. And yet, why is it written in the plural? So Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch points out that what it means is that there isn't just one camp that has to be holy. All camps have to be holy. And here's the way Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says it. What is said here primarily for military camps, of course, is meant to apply to any camp, meaning to any sphere in which we might temporarily or permanently settle. All are to bear the stamp of a pure moral way of life. All the places where we live, not just our synagogues and schools have to be holy. They're not to be defiled by the. A moment. They're not to lack. They're not to lack the consecration by thoughts of the mission of our life. So it may say machanecha, which is singular, but it's written as plural, because we have many camps in our lives, and the camps are not just the synagogue, not just the school, but as we've been seeing throughout this parasha, everything, the kitchen, the being outside and seeing somebody, seeing something lost. All of our spheres of life have to be sanctified. And this is a point that Hirsch makes in many times throughout his commentary, that the Torah is an all-encompassing way of life. It's not purely for the synagogue, it's not purely for the school, it's for all areas of life, all of the machanot, all of our camps, but the word is read as singular because all of these camps have to be united as one holy camp. Well, as I said, there's many mitzvot in this parasha. I've tried to hit on, to touch on most of them. Highly recommend that you read through this parasha because there really is a great deal going on. And I thank you very much for joining me and look forward to speaking to you again next time. Shalom.